Jenny Critchlow. And hello everybody, welcome to your weekly podcast with me, Jenny Critchlow, Why Now? And following on from last week when we were looking at the story the friend of my daughter told about how someone looked at him in the mall and how he then told himself a story that wasn't actually true when we pulled it apart, but also tentatively looking at him, the fact that as humans we tell stories that confirm our worst fears about ourselves. And then what came in last week was a little bit of that email that a friend sent me with an acronym of FEAR, standing for false evidence appearing real. And when I was listening back to it all and thinking, oh, wow, that's probably where we're going with this today, is that fear, the word fear, and we are actually going to go there, strikes fear into the heart of every person in the world. And fear is a really interesting thing, and it's incredibly debilitating. And most of us dictate an enormous part of our lives through the lowest common denominator of fear. And it's important to look at it because when we tell ourselves those kind of stories that we were discussing last week, so where someone looks at us and then we make up a story about what that look meant, and that story tends to confirm our worst fears about ourselves, and that's where we look. The other thing that fear does is cripple us. Fear stops us going out there and making decisions and doing things that we all say we would like to do eventually one day. And one day eventually possibly never comes when we go into fear. So while fear, that a new acronym that my friend told me about, feeling excited and ready, the one I know more normally is false evidence appearing real. And in recovery, we use either, excuse the language, fuck everything and run, or face everything and recover. And possibly I should have warned you that there was going to be some swearing there in case you're listening in the car with your kids. Ever so sorry, but a great moment to look at parenting through fear and explaining swear words to our little children. I promise no more spoilers about anything else there. Anyway, the thing is with fear, is that the fear of fear, the fear of that awful feeling, causes us to find and tell stories about ourselves and about the outside world that aren't necessarily true, and often cause us a great deal of suffering. The major fear for us humans is the breakdown of the sense of how the world sees us. Because what actually, for most of the things we say we're afraid of, or we want to do but don't, or we pretend we're going to do but don't actually do anything about it, for most things that humans fear, what we really fear is feeling bad. What we truly fear is feeling bad, that horrible, awful feeling of being embarrassed, vulnerable, exposed, judged, found out. Think about how, especially the word exposed and judged, how do those words make you feel? Think of a time, especially this often happens in our schooling at school, because that's part of the reason we're so frightened, is that a lot of our schooling as children was through shame and fear. Being pulled out in front of other people, being told off in front of other people. And the feeling that we get is horrendous. It's crippling and it's small. And right now, as I'm speaking, I'm almost curling into this tiny little ball while trying to still speak into the microphone, while I feel and remember all those horrible moments where I felt such shame and vulnerability. And actually, that shame and vulnerability and that fear, what goes on in that moment when we feel that actually is a process. And it's a process of the breakdown of who we think we are. The breakdown of who we think we are. And if you've been listening to these podcasts sequentially, there will be a point where you might be pinging here and thinking, yeah, hold on a second. We began this with our thoughts being quite mad and a terrible roommate and a roommate that lies and isn't very pleasant to live with. And we let that roommate, those thoughts, tell us who we think we are, often quite negatively. But in order to survive in the world, we put on a nice big body of armour, trying to show the world that we don't really feel like that. And it's the breakdown of that facade, of that armour, that exposes this awful feeling of shame and vulnerability and feeling crippled. And then we feel who we truly think we are, which is this flawed and vulnerable and, well, think of all the things you secretly worry that you may well be. And what the breakdown in that shield does is fear that everybody else sees it too. And we feel dreadful. Really dreadful. But the dichotomy of all of this, and I think one of the most incredibly useful ways of seeing how we do it to others, is that we use that breakdown of other people, that exposure of vulnerability, that you weren't really as great as you thought you were, as entertainment. The reason reality TV took off so phenomenally was that, especially in the early days, it was based around exposing people, ridiculing them for their illusion in who they thought they were. And we sat in front of our tellies and pointed, judged, laughed and ridiculed, doing all the things to them in the safety of our own home that we fear done to us. Get them before they get us. So Big Brother, put people in a house for long enough, you can't keep the facade up. You have to eventually expose who you really are behind closed doors. And then we pounce and judge and don't like them and vote them off and write about them and blog about them. Think of the early days of the X Factor. Most of the audition tapes were having a good old laugh at the delusion, the illusion of who they were, of most of the people that came through. The good ones were a bit boring. Oh, they're really good, excellent, yeah, move on. Let's have a laugh at the chicken guy. And we did. And that was the entertainment. I think it's interesting now, if you watch the X Factor, that most of those, what they might call bloopers, aren't shown anymore. We seem to have evolved as a society, and we feel much more uncomfortable at laughing people who just aren't very good at singing. That's it. But there's another side to this that I think is incredible, and it's understanding that. And I'm going to ask you whether you would be brave enough to do the same thing. Is that the truly brave people on programmes like The X Factor are people who are quite good. Not the amazing ones whose piano teacher or singing teacher has said, you know what, you really ought to do this, get yourself some exposure. But the people who gave it a go in front of millions of people, who may well, I'm sure, have sat and judged and criticised and dismissed and voted off other people. Those people have faced one of the biggest fears we have of ourselves as people. I don't mean fears about loss and fears about disaster. I'm talking about that fear inside of ourselves, that fears we're fraudulent, that fears judgment, that fears exposure, that pounces on the chance to do that to other people on the telly, say, and other people in real life, because we feel so much better. There's a great line, I may suck at this, but they suck at it worse. I mean, I'm not stupid enough to go on the X Factor and not be able to sing. I'd find out first. But think about those people that can sing and go on the X Factor and don't make it. Or think about one of my favourite programmes, MasterChef The Professionals. I love that programme. Those are professional chefs going up to be judged against their peers, and they may not make it through round one, and they've got to go back to work. and face everybody as someone that exposed themselves to this judgment. And may well, and many of them do, because there's only one winner, feel that who they thought they were as a chef is lacking. And that's done in a really public way. Kindly nowadays, but it is. And so where we're going with this, or where I'm going with this, is that fear is a big crippler. But it's understanding what that fear truly is. And that fear, for most of us, is being seen, being vulnerable, and it not working out. I'm speaking from absolute experience here at the moment because I'm launching another project at the end of this month, and it involves being completely vulnerable and completely exposed in many ways, with no guarantee of how it will evolve or what will go. And my ego is cringing behind the curtain and doesn't want to do it at all. But I know that my heart wants to do it so much, I'm gonna have to do it. And my ego's sort of peeking around going, yeah, well, if it goes well, we'll really enjoy that, Jen. Nah, you don't get a look in. Is that fear, that vulnerability is crippling, but not as crippling as living a life hiding behind the curtain, waiting for a surety that I'll be chosen for X Factor or win MasterChef, or this project will go well. And when we face that and do it anyway, when we understand that we may well feel the feelings of humiliation, I may well feel the feelings of abandonment or failure, the fact remains is I've removed some of that armour, and that armour isn't who I am. It's who I want everyone to see I am while I scrabble around inside trying to feel better about how I truly am, which is crackers. It's just crackers. So my job is to understand that I fear that feeling and take the armour off anyway. Because from that point, from that vulnerable, exposed point, that wound, I can build something authentic from there. And next time I go out to be vulnerable and exposed, it's not as painful and not as fearful. It is much more fully who I am, rather than who I choose to try and get you to think I am. And I'm wondering if you can see the same in yourself. The worst that can happen is you feel bad, humiliated, exposed and vulnerable. But hiding from those feelings, armouring yourself up from those feelings, never ever serves you. It's a life half lived. And as it's the first week in January, oh, it isn't, it's the second. Forget that. Okay, it's the second week in January. I invite you to have a look at the year ahead and have a look at you inside. Think about what frightens you and maybe choose to do at least one of those things that you're putting off for fear of judgment or exposure or vulnerability, and see how it goes. I've got to do it next week, but wish me luck. It's been lovely to talk to you as always. Looking forward to talking to you next Monday. Have a wonderful week.